Hello everyone and welcome to another video of the NEET PG Coach. In this video we'll be talking about JVP or jugular venous pressure. The normal jugular venous pressure is between 6 to 8 centimeters of water. We know that the JVP is a very useful bedside tool to assess the cardiac function of the patient to determine whether the patient is in CHF or not. So what we do is we make the patient lie down at an angle of make the patient lie down at an angle of 30 degrees, 45 degrees, or 60 degrees, and measure the distance between the highest point of pulsation on the neck and the sternal angle. Now, this distance in centimeter is added to 5, the number 5. So this will give you a value, and this value is supposed to be less than 6 to 8 centimeter. If it is more than 8 centimeter, you consider it as abnormal JVP. So where did this number 5 come from? So this number 5 comes from the fact that the distance between sternal angle of Louis and mid-right atrium is taken to be 5 centimeter. So the distance is calculated between the sternal angle and the highest point of pulsation, and that is added to the number 5. Because number 5 centimeters is the distance, but because 5 centimeters is the distance between the angle of Louis and the mid-right atrium. So if you, for example, there's a patient and the distance between the sternal angle and the highest point of pulsation is 5 centimeter. And you add another 5 centimeter to this, which is a constant, which is always added, just as I described here. So you get the value as 10 centimeter. So 10 centimeter of water is obviously elevated JVP. So the normal range is between 6 to 8 centimeter of water, and if it is 10 centimeter of water, you'd say that it is elevated. Now, as you all might be knowing, there's a simple formula for converting centimeter of water into millimeter of mercury. So what you do is basically divide by 1.36. So 6 divided by 1.36 or 8 divided by 1.36. So here you get the value as let's go ahead and divide. 6 divided by 1.36 will give us 4.4 millimeter of mercury to 8 divided by 1.36 will give us 5.8 millimeters of mercury. So you can say in terms of millimeter of mercury that between 4.4 and 5.8 is considered as a normal JVP. Anything over this is considered abnormal. So now that we had a basic understanding of what JVP is, we'll discuss about the different waveforms that are seen in JVP. So there are 3 positive waves, as you can see here. A, C, and V are the positive waves, and the initial part of the X descent, the X descent proper, and the Y descent, they're all the negative waves. So why do these different waves occur? Now, we can understand that by a simple diagram. So this is obviously a very basic diagram. So this is the SVC, and this is the right atrium, this is the right ventricle, and this is the pulmonary artery which comes from the right ventricle. And this SVC is formed by the different merging of different brachiocephalic veins, and also obviously the IJV. So this is the IJV. And one more thing that you need to know is that JVP is usually measured at the level of IJV, because IJV is non-valved, is non-valved and is more in line with SVC and right atrium. So because of this, you will take the IJV to measure the JVP. So the reason for the different waves. The A wave is due to right atrial contraction. So imagine when the right atrium is contracting, the pressure inside this chamber is going to increase. So this will get transmitted to the SVC, and to the IJV. So that will lead to a positive wave in the tracing. So right atrial contraction causes a positive wave, that is the A wave. And the next positive wave that we have here is the C wave. The C wave occurs during ventricular systole. During ventricular systole, the tricuspid valve, which is here, is pushed into the right atrium like this. So, as the tricuspid valve is pushed into the right atrium, that also increases the pressure inside the right atrial cavity. And this is transmitted all the way back to the IJV. That would cause a positive C wave. And the X descent. The X descent occurs as the tricuspid valve from its bulged position inside the right atrium comes back to its normal position. You can have this X descent. And the V wave. The V wave occurs during the right atrial filling as blood pours in from different parts of the body through the SVC and IVC into the right atrium. You can imagine that the pressure inside the right atrium is going to increase. And this pressure is going to be transmitted all the way back to the IJV. That will lead to a positive V wave. And the Y descent. The reason for the Y descent is it happens during the rapid filling phase of the ventricle. As soon as the tricuspid valve opens, there's a huge volume of blood which gushes from the right atrium into the right ventricle. And so this relieves the pressure inside the right atrium, and this also consequently gets transmitted all the way back to the IJV, and that leads to the Y descent. So to sum up, A wave is due to atrial contraction, C wave is due to the tricuspid valve bulge into right atrium, and the X descent is due to tricuspid valve returning to normal position, and the V wave is because of the atrial filling, and the Y descent is because of ventricular filling, right ventricular filling. As the tricuspid valve opens, the blood rushes back inside the right ventricle, and the pressure on the right atrium falls, so you have the Y descent. And know that during ventricular filling, there are two phases. One is early rapid phase and a late slow phase. A rapid phase is non-contraction dependent, and the slower phase is contraction dependent. So what do I mean by that? Contraction dependent and non-contraction dependent. So non-contraction dependent means as soon as the tricuspid valve opens, please imagine this is the right atrium, all the blood is going to flow. Around 70 to 80% of the blood volume flows into the right ventricle during this time. So that is the early rapid filling phase. This does not need a right atrial contraction. During the late slower phase, the right atrium contracts and pushes the remaining 20 to 30% blood into the right ventricle. So this is the slower phase. This is a contraction dependent phase. So as we said before, that is represented by the A wave on the JVP. That represents the atrial contraction. The Y descent is due to the early rapid filling phase, which is non-contraction dependent. And one more important thing that they might ask you in the exams or some pathological changes in the JVP waveforms. For example, you'll see large A waves in the following conditions. Like, for example, you can see large A waves in tricuspid stenosis, pulmonary hypertension, In these conditions, you can see large A waves. So the reason for that being, when the tricuspid valve is stenosed, the right atrium cannot empty properly, so there is back pressure, and that gets transmitted all the way back to the IJV, and you can have a large A wave. And in pulmonary hypertension, what happens is the right ventricular compliance is greatly reduced because of muscular hypertrophy of the right ventricular wall, um, because the right ventricle has to contract more to overcome the pulmonary artery pressure. So the right ventricle hypertrophies, and the compliance of the right ventricle decreases because there is more muscle than cavity in the right ventricle. So what happens is the right ventricle does not fill properly, and in order to fill the right ventricle, the right atrium has to contract more vigorously. So all these things will lead to back pressure. This back pressure gets transmitted all the way back to the IJV, and you have large A waves and tricuspid stenosis and pulmonary hypertension. The other condition that they might ask you is Canon A waves. Canon A waves are seen in third degree heart block. In third degree heart block, there is complete AV dissociation, meaning to say atria contract independently of the ventricle. Atria contract independently of the ventricle. So when the tricuspid valve is closed and if the right atrium is contracting, obviously there will be a lot of pressure that is generated here, which gets transmitted all the way back to the IJV, and that can lead to Canon A waves. Canon A waves are seen in third degree heart block with AV dissociation when the atria contract independently of the ventricles, specifically when the atria are contracting against a closed tricuspid valve. Okay, so the next condition, the next pathological waveform that we're going to talk about is a accentuated V wave. Accentuated V wave. Accentuated means that V wave is basically just more pronounced. Like in which condition you can have a more pronounced V wave? The answer to that would be tricuspid regurgitation. Accentuated V wave. You can see that in tricuspid regurgitation. So why is that? So in tricuspid regurgitation, the incompetent tricuspid valve is unable to prevent the backflow of blood from the right ventricle also. So the right atrium receives blood not only from the SVC, IVC, it also receives blood from the right ventricle. So there is a large volume of blood inside the right atrium. So the large volume of blood obviously creates a large amount of pressure. So this V wave will be more accentuated or more pronounced in tricuspid regurgitation. Basically, you're volume overloading the right atrium. And when the right atrium, when the tricuspid valve opens and it's time for the right atrium to empty its blood into the right ventricle, there's consequently a large volume of blood flowing into the right ventricle also. And that creates a rapid Y descent. So accentuated V wave and rapid Y descent are hallmarks of tricuspid regurgitation. So till now we've seen about large A waves, Canon A waves, accentuated V wave, and a rapid Y descent. Now we should see about certain conditions which cause a slow or prolonged Y descent. So there are certain conditions which cause a slow or prolonged Y descent. And number one would be pericardial tamponade. The other one would be tricuspid stenosis. So anything which impairs the right ventricular filling will cause a prolonged Y descent. So in tricuspid stenosis, obviously there is a stenosed tricuspid valve and the right ventricular filling is getting impaired. So that would lead to a prolonged Y descent. The other condition is pericardial tamponade. And there is fluid around the heart that would obviously impair the ability of the right ventricle to relax and thereby connect with blood. And that would obviously cause a prolonged Y descent. So any condition which would impair the filling of the right ventricle will cause a prolonged Y descent. So going back to the diagram again, what did I say causes the Y descent? Y descent is due to the rapid filling phase of the ventricle. As soon as the tricuspid valve opens, the blood gushing into the right ventricle causes the Y descent. So anything which would impair this process, like for example, the tricuspid valve not opening fully, like opening just half, tricuspid stenosis, or the right ventricle not being able to relax fully because there is fluid around the fluid in the pericardium, which is impairing the ability of the right ventricle to distend and thereby fill with blood. So all these conditions which will cause a slow or prolonged Y descent. So we've seen about accentuated V wave and rapid Y descent, slower prolonged Y descent, large A waves, and Canon A waves. So one more thing that you need to know with regard to JVP is the Kussmaul sign. This is different from Kussmaul's breathing, which you see in DKA. So this Kussmaul sign is seen in the following conditions: constrictive pericarditis, restrictive cardiomyopathy, right ventricular infarction, massive pulmonary embolism, and the other one will be severe LV systolic dysfunction. You don't have to memorize any of this, let me tell you. So normally, let me tell you the normal physiology. So what happens is during inspiration, there is a 3 millimeter mercury fall in the venous pressure. So this is a rule. This always happens. During deep inspiration, there is a 3 millimeter of mercury fall in venous pressure. Now, Kussmaul sign is defined as a lack of fall or a rise in, in the JVP during inspiration. So inspiration, there is supposed to be a 3 millimeter of mercury fall in the venous pressure, but Kussmaul sign is defined as a lack of fall or a rise in JVP during inspiration. It is found in these conditions, these 5 conditions that I have mentioned. So why does it occur in these 5 conditions? So just you know about these conditions, just relate these conditions with right ventricular filling. Just look at right ventricular filling and see what happens in these conditions. In constrictive pericarditis, there's a calcified, plaque-like layer just surrounding the heart, and this impairs the filling of the ventricles. So you can hear that pericardial knock and everything on your clinical examination. So this impairs the filling of the ventricles. So if going back to this diagram again, if the right ventricle is not filled properly, what's going to happen? There's going to be backup of blood in the right atrium, and that backup is going to go all the way into the IJV. There is the central vein, and that is going to cause an increase in central venous pressure. So constrictive pericarditis can be explained by that. And restrictive cardiomyopathy. Restrictive cardiomyopathy occurs in certain infiltrative diseases of the heart, like amyloidosis, sarcoidosis, and certain other conditions, certain other rare conditions. So basically, what happens in this condition also is there is an impairment of filling of the right ventricle. So this impairment in filling gets transmitted all the way back into the right atrium. There is backup of blood in the right atrium and the central veins, and this leads to an increase in the central venous pressure. So that is one. The other one is right ventricular infarction. The right ventricle is infarcted, it is not contracting. So if it's not contracting, obviously there's going to be backup of blood in the right atrium. It gets transmitted all the way back into the veins. So that is that. So the other one is massive pulmonary embolism. For example, this is the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary artery comes here. One second. This is the pulmonary artery, and you have a big embolus line here. So what is going to happen here? This is going to create acute right ventricular strain. So the right ventricle is not contracting. So it is contracting, but the blood is not going. So where is the blood going to back up? In the right atrium, all the way inside the great veins, and this can lead to an increased JVP or a lack of fall in JVP on inspiration, leading to a positive Kussmaul sign. The last one is severe left ventricular systolic dysfunction. So what happens? So you all know that the most common cause of right heart failure is left heart failure. So as the left heart fails, there is lack of blood in the pulmonary circulation, and that backs up all the way into volume overloads the right side of the heart, and thereby the right heart also fails. So severe left ventricular systolic dysfunction leading to right ventricular dysfunction, leading to a positive Kussmaul sign. So you don't have to memorize these conditions. So this can be explained away by just relating it with right ventricular filling. So this is about Kussmaul sign. And some clinical correlates before we wrap up. Some clinical correlates. There is a reflex called hepatojugular reflex. You elicit this reflex by applying firm, consistent pressure in the right upper quadrant for 15 seconds and observing for a 3 centimeter rise, 3 cm rise in JVP. So this happens when the patient is in CHF, when the patient is in congestive heart failure. You can elicit a positive hepatojugular reflex. Like once you apply pressure, if there's a 3 centimeter rise in JVP after 15 seconds of firm pressure in the right upper quadrant, you see that the hepatojugular reflex is positive. The patient is in severe CHF. So this actually translates to a pulmonary capillary wedge pressure of 15 millimeters of mercury. So what do I mean by that? So the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure is the pressure which is measured by a catheter called Swan-Ganz catheter. During this, what you do is you insert a catheter inside the IJV, and that goes all the way down to the SVC and the right atrium, and also the right ventricle, and off comes the pulmonary artery from here. Okay, so what you do is you insert a catheter through the great veins into the SVC, into right atrium, right ventricle, and then into the pulmonary arteries, and then to the smaller pulmonary vessels, all the way up to the smallest pulmonary capillary. So once it becomes wedged in that pulmonary capillary, you can measure the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. So pulmonary capillary wedge pressure is determined to distinguish between cardiogenic and non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema. For example, if the patient is having left heart failure, there is going to be backup of blood inside. For example, this is the left atrium and this is the left ventricle. The left heart has failed, means there's going to be accumulation of blood here, and this receives its input from the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins are coming from the lungs, and this back pressure is transmitted into the small pulmonary capillaries. So the pressure from the failing left ventricle is transmitted to the left atrium, the pulmonary veins, to the pulmonary capillaries, and this is picked up by our catheter, which is lodged in the pulmonary capillaries. So it is wedged there basically. So that's why you call it pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. So the hepatojugular reflex is positive. It translates to pulmonary capillary wedge pressure of 15 millimeter, which is obviously elevated. So if the hepatojugular reflex is positive, you can say with about 90% certainty that the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure is going to be more than 15 millimeters of mercury. And some of the other uses of JVP are, if the JVP is elevated, the patient's chance of being hospitalized from heart failure, having poor quality of life due to heart failure, or even dying due to heart failure are greatly increased. So these are some of the things about JVP that you need to know for your exams. First, we discussed about the normal JVP, how it is measured bedside, and how do you convert the centimeter to millimeters of mercury, and why you prefer the IJV, because it's like non-valved and it's more in line with the SVC and the right atrium. And we discussed about the different waveforms of JVP, why they occur, and what are certain conditions where you can have certain abnormalities with the waveforms, which are frequently tested in your exam. So to recap, I would just like to make one final point. The A wave is due to atrial contraction, C wave is due to tricuspid valve bulge into the right atrium as ventricle contracts, X descent is as the tricuspid valve comes back to its normal position from the bulged position, and V wave is due to atrial filling, and Y descent is due to ventricular filling. So that'll be it about JVP. I'll be meeting you in another video shortly. Thank you for watching.